This evening, we're very privileged to have a special guest here, and the guest talk by Dr. Adil Najam is part of our South Asia Media and Cultural Studies Conference. 2024 is our 10th annual conference. We've had it in this room for the early part of the year for the last 10 years. Each year we've had between 20 and 30 presenters from United States, Europe, and most importantly from South Asia. Our conference this morning ran from 7 o'clock till about 1:30 p.m. And we had virtual presenters from a lot of them from South Asia, but also from the United States. And so we had a really good set of papers and discussions. And this event serves three purposes. First, it's part of the Engage Your World series at the Center for Global Engagement here. And as you know, that's an ongoing series of lectures, bringing in guests to talk about important issues from around the world. This is also the keynote address for the South Asia Media and Cultural Studies Conference. And thirdly, it's a part of a lecture series from the College of Social Sciences and Public Policy. And so welcome, and I'll introduce my colleague, Dr. John Mayo, to talk about the lecture series and also to introduce a guest speaker. And we're really happy that everyone's here tonight. This is also being live streamed, just so you know that. So just be aware if you say something or do something, it's out to the world. Thank you again.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks everyone for being here. Before introducing our distinguished speaker, I too want to thank the College of Social Sciences and Public Policy, the College of Communication and Information, and the Center for Global Engagement for sponsoring this event and the conference. Dr. Adil Najam is our conference's keynote speaker this afternoon. He's one of the world's most respected environmental and conservation leaders. Last July, Dr. Najam was named president of the Worldwide Fund for Nature. The WWF, as it's known, was founded as the World Wildlife Fund in Geneva, Switzerland in 1961. It retains the title of the Wildlife Fund in North America, Canada, and the US. Its mission is to preserve diversity, address climate change, and empower local communities through development, sustainable development of all kinds. Dr. Najam is also a distinguished academic, both in the US and in Pakistan, his home country. He is professor of international relations, earth and the environment at the Frederick Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. Dr. Najam was the founding dean of the Pardee School in 2014. He has continued teaching there since he was awarded Dean Emeritus status in 2022. In recent years, he has also been a visiting fellow at Oxford University Wilson College and the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies. Dr. Najam has served on many international boards and received numerous awards, scholarly awards, and service awards. I'll name just one. In 2017, the Information Technology University in Lahore, Pakistan, his hometown, awarded Dr. Najam an honorary doctorate for his contributions in science, climate change, and sustainable development. I singled out this award because it aligns us so closely with the goals and substance of our 10th annual SAMCS conference. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Najam to FSU.
Thank you, John. Thank you for that gracious introduction. Whoever that person you were talking about, I would like to meet him too. But thank you very much. Can I get some help on the lights here? To turn the lights off here as we. Okay, got it. Thank you so much. It is a great pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me. I have had the pleasure of spending the day here and seeing conference panels and learning from them and learning a lot from them. So thank you for hosting me, and thank you for inviting me to talk about environment and climate change and sustainable development. This is my first time at FSU, and I'll talk in a minute about why I'm particularly excited about this. And I'm very honored by the gracious introduction, but also the multiple things that this talk is. So I do not work on communication per se, though I'll say something about it. I work on climate change. I work on climate change and development. I work on climate change and development in particular in developing countries and amongst poor communities. And as was mentioned, have the great honor and privilege of currently representing WWF International as its president. The introduction was very gracious, John, but let me add something to it, because it might surprise you too, and it might make this relevant. And it's one of the reasons why I was so excited to be here today, because it's the thing that doesn't make it to my CV. The very first thing I ever published academically or intellectually was this paper. This is 1987. It was called Communicating Conservation. It was the very first thing I did right after undergraduate. And my undergraduate was in engineering. So you can see from those funky diagrams that the engineer was hard at work. If I saw this paper today, I would reject it immediately because it had this top-down notion of how you should be communicating, and you could do it in beautiful diagrams. But you have allowed me this opportunity to revisit the memory of something that I did learn from a lot. I wrote it mostly because I was a practicing journalist for many years, and at that time, and that's what brought me into this conversation about communication and conservation, which I want to. Here is the other interesting fact. And this is a fact that I can only talk about for another 2 weeks before a paper that's forthcoming comes out. The most recent paper I've published is this. And this was late last year with a colleague at Oxford, Vikas Ijaz, who's at the Reuters Institute at Oxford, and this was in the journal Social Media and Society, and the paper is about the Global South and climate change, where we argue that we should be moving, we will be seeing a shift, and are already seeing a major shift from developing countries, the Global South, being news takers to news makers in terms of climate. I will leave this to you. Now, I should also note, I have written nothing about climate, nothing about communication in between these two papers. So it just happens that this allows me to sort of bookend this. By way of what I want to say to you, not as a communication person, and not even as WWF. I admire the panda, and therefore I always get advice from the panda before anything important, and I can promise you I did that right before this. But I want to speak to you as a South Asian. I want to speak to you as someone who works on development. I want to speak to you as someone who works on climate change. And none of that is not about WWF, and I'm happy to talk about it later, but I want to talk in that capacity as a friend of people who study communication, who study development, who study environment, about where I think things are headed and why it is a challenge for all of us who might care about these issues in the context of global climate change. As I do that, I want to raise 3 questions. And I promise you, I will not answer any of them. Because if I did, we'll have nothing to talk about. And I do want to do that. And it's not the type of questions that can be answered, but it is the type of questions we should think about. The first of those questions is, what does global mean? Right? We are, and people in this are of a generation where global has become a word. Global was not always a word. It's a very recent word, right? You needed the pale blue planet and Carl Sagan and Apollo to be able to come to the idea of global. We use it all the time, right? Global finance, global climate, global health, global economy, global politics, Hakuna Matata, everyone together. Right? But if we really believe that there is something called global climate change, then we should put some thought into what this term means. And I want to do that in part of what I say. The second question I want us to think about is, what is the climate telling us? Not what scientists are telling you. I've spent much of my life in the sciences, particularly with the IPCC and stuff. And not what the science is telling us, not what the scientists are telling us, not what governments or politicians are telling us, not what the media is telling us. All of that is important. This is not to say it's not important. But at this point, on this day, in 2024, you don't really need that. There is something that the weather outside, the climate outside, that window, if there were a window there, is telling us. And I think we are now at a point that we should be listening to that as well as everything else, right? This is not about not listening to the science, but in some ways not using science as an excuse to not listen to the science, right? And so that's the second question. And the third question I want us to think about is, how does what I call the age of adaptation, that's what I've been talking about, writing about for the last 6-7 years, that we are in the age of adaptation. How does the age of adaptation change how we think about climate change? And in many ways, that's my, not challenge, that is my invitation to those of you who do communication, to those of you who do information, to those of you who do development, to those of you who do policy, to those of you who do science. Right? Now, I'll become sort of technical for a minute. I assume everyone knows this in this audience. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. But in climate change, there are two terms. Now we have a third, or two and a half. The first big term is mitigation. Right? So much of climate policy has been mostly about mitigation. When you talk about climate or you hear it on your television sets, mostly that is about mitigation. Mitigation is, what do I do to keep a problem from happening? Right? And most of that is about carbon. That's why we talk a lot about energy. We figure out the science, and the science is that carbon emissions is causing or could cause climate change. So mitigation is, what can I do to carbon emissions? It's essentially carbon management. I spent my whole life teaching people to become carbon managers, right? And that is the central challenge, so that the problem doesn't happen. That's mitigation. Now, if you fail in mitigation, you have to do adaptation. Right? Now, I want to make this clear. Adaptation is the failure of mitigation, but it is not the opposite of mitigation, because you have to still mitigate, because the less you mitigate, the more you'll have to adapt. But if you fail to mitigate, keep a problem from happening, then you have to somehow do something to respond to the impacts of that problem. That's called adaptation policy. I'll talk about a lot. And adaptation, the good news is we are really good at adaptation. In fact, that is the superpower of most people in this room. In fact, that is why you are in this room and other species are not. As a species, we have been able to adapt to a lot of things, right? So it is cold, you wear a sweater, adaptation. It rains, umbrella, adaptation, right? So we're really good at thinking about adaptation. The problem is, adaptation is a cost. The umbrella has a cost. The sweater has a cost. And in this case, the justice question comes in, because those who are causing the problem, you and me, are different from those who are at the front end of its impacts. Right? That's why environmental justice is such a central theme in what we are talking about. The rain, it raineth every day on rich and poor fella, but more on the poor because the rich has his umbrella. right? So that is adaptation. And as I said, now we are getting into a third thing. If you fail to adapt, now we are beginning to realize if you do fail to adapt, then you get into the realm of loss and damage. Then there is that flood, then there is that loss, then there is that damage, then there is that death, right? And in some ways, that's the broad stroke of where global climate policy is about: mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage. But mitigation again is the failure. Adaptation is the failure of mitigation, but not the opposite. That I do want you to know. Okay, I'm sorry about sort of going into that little detail, but I know everyone knows that. I have a proposition, and it's a pretty strong proposition. So you are very welcome to disagree. Many do, but here is my proposition. My proposition is that the age of adaptation. That's too many words on a screen, so let's make it easy. The age of adaptation fundamentally changes. Right? That's the drastic part of what I'm saying. It fundamentally changes, not just changes. Change happens all the time. Fundamental change is change that causes other things to change. Right? And the structure of something changes. That the age of adaptation fundamentally changes what? It changes the nature of climate policy. It changes the nature of climate politics. That if you're working on climate, as I do, I am suggesting that what we think climate policy is, or what climate policy has been, will change. Which doesn't mean old issues go away, but they become different things. And the nature of climate politics changes. I think we are already seeing that. It becomes much more adversarial. Hakuna Matata is over, because in the age of particularly loss and damage, it is my loss versus your damage, right? In the age of mitigation, we can all hold hands and say it's a common problem. The closer you get to adaptation and loss and damage, the politics becomes much more adversarial. That's my fear. However, for this audience in particular, I suggest that this introduces new challenges and new opportunities to communicating sustainable development. Right? And that's part of the argument I want to make, not as a communication argument, but as a sustainable development or environment or climate argument. So let me try to get into that. Can I ask the Associate Provost, is it okay to be silly at FSU? Yes. Okay, thank you. You need official permission. So allow me to be silly. Now, this slide I actually have been using in my classes for many years, and it is actually a class assignment, so I might even ask you to answer this question by taking a page. Imagine for a moment you're not in Tallahassee. Right? Imagine I ask my students to do this, and we have great fun. But imagine for a moment you're not in Tallahassee. Imagine you're not in Florida. Imagine you're not in the US. Imagine you're not even on this planet. Imagine you're on some other planet. Choose your planet. There used to be 9, now they say there are 8, and at least one of them is not doing very well. And on that planet, the World Bank or the UN of that planet has asked you to write in 2 pages or less. That's the student assignment. 2 pages or less, Times Roman, 12 point, no footnotes. In 2 pages or less, to write a country report on the country called Earth. Someone is looking down on us, and they want to see what sort of a place are we, right? If global is real, someone is looking at us and saying, what sort of a planet is this, right? I'm not talking about world government and all that sort of silly stuff. But just like we think of countries and we aspire, we ascribe realities to them, what would someone say if they were looking at us as a globe? There can be many stories, and I have many versions of this. I'll only show you one version. You could immediately come to the conclusion that they would first of all say, country Earth is a poor country. Right? They would look at us, they would count the numbers, you all know the numbers. They will say there is more than 500 million people who live on less than $2 a day. It used to be $1 a day, but the dollar ain't what it used to be. Right? That number has come down, but it's still more than half a billion people. So you would say country Earth is a poor planet. You would say, however, while it is poor, it is not universally poor. It is a divided planet. Right? 80% of its people live on 20% of resources. 20% of its people or less consume 80%. of its wealth, right? That famous champagne glass from Dr. Mehboob Haq, one of my great mentors, the champagne glass distribution of the world, you would want it like a beer mug, not the German beer mug, but the Austrian beer mug, but it's much more like a champagne glass. Right? So you would come to the conclusion, you all know these numbers, you see them in UN reports and so on and so forth in the World Bank. Planet Earth is a poor planet, planet Earth is a divided planet, planet Earth is a poorly governed planet. By everything we call good governance, when we talk about countries, if you apply that to the world as a whole, you would easily come to the conclusion this is not a very well-governed place. Right? All countries equal, 5 more equal than others, so on and so forth. You will come to the conclusion that it is also not just poor, divided, poorly governed, it's an insecure, right? Particularly today, an insecure planet, not just because of the uselessness of war, but insecure in terms of food insecurity, insecure in terms of water insecurity, insecure in terms of climate security. So multiple dimensions of insecurity. Again, you know the numbers, so I won't go in there. And as I said, there are multiple a different picture of how science has progressed and more people are educated and stuff. That is also true. But so is this. You will come to the conclusion it's a poor, it's a divided, it's a poorly governed, it's an insecure, it is a degraded planet. That's why we drink out of bottles. Our deserts are denuded, our forests are degraded, our climate is changing, our seas are rising, and it is an angry planet. Right? If you, particularly those of you in communication, if you go back to whatever you were seeing right before COVID, whether it was on your Facebook scroll, whether you actually were reading newspapers, I'm not sure if people do that anymore, but if you try to remember the pictures you were seeing, it was mostly pictures of angry people, nearly all of them young people. JNU, India, angry. Chile, on the streets, angry young people. London, Extinction Rebellion, angry young people. Lebanon, angry young people. New York, angry young people. Right? Hong Kong, yellow umbrellas, angry young people. Right? And there is anger for a reason. I think it's justified anger, particularly from the young, and particularly on the issue I'm talking about. In some ways on the issue I'm talking about, and that's why I have Greta there, I fully understand Greta's anger. I think it is justified. I do not always agree with maybe the policy approach, but the anger is, it's like I was saying this to some friends this afternoon over lunch. It's like, when you have a long drive and you have kids at the back of the car, and at some point they start asking, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Right? And it's a justified question. At some point, you have to say whether we are there yet or not, because we've been saying we are getting there. Right? Now, again, I can go a lot into this, and this is something I work on, because the young might feel smug about this, but please don't, because I can promise you one thing: by the time I'm done talking, you will be less young than you were when I started talking, which means you will be very soon where I am. Right? And we will be judged by our actions, not just by our emotions. You will come to the conclusion that the planet as a country is a poor planet, a divided planet, a poorly governed planet, insecure, degraded, angry, and an unsafe planet. Right? By all the actual measures that we use to ascribe countries, how we have State Department travel advisories? If you actually, by those very measures, had a travel advisory on planet Earth, it would be cash the first rocket ship out of here. The problem is Elon Musk has not yet come up with the rocket ship. Right? I am sorry, I did not want to sort of be depressing here, but the point I'm trying to make, as I said, I can give you a different picture, and maybe in the Q&A I will. The point I'm making is, we are trying in a global level to govern a planet that is in fact a third world planet. I have never liked the term third world. In this context, it is the right word to use. Whatever you conjure up, right? And yet we try to manage it as if it was planet Sweden. It is, in fact, the planet that is defined by that. That has been the challenge of global climate policy in terms of our international relations friends, especially. That we are trying to manage it as if it was a different planet from what it actually is. Right? And that brings me to the second issue. part of what I want to say. So first is about thinking about global, who we are as global. Life after Paris. Right? Now let's move to that second question, and I'll try to connect all of them as I go forth. This is about the climate side. People understand when I mean Paris here, I mean the Paris Agreement, or the so-called Paris Agreement about climate. I won't go into it. I happen to be a creature of, I was at Paris, and it took me 15 minutes to realize that was a mistake. But that is fine. I wish it well. I wish it well. But I didn't really believe what was coming out of it because I spent too much of my life following these negotiations. There are two major numbers that came out of it. There are two major numbers that came out of it. And the first one was this number. People know what that number is? How many zeros? At that point, it was awe and shock. Right? If you're going to make up a number that is so big that people are stunned. So this number was 100 billion. 100 billion was the promise of what would be spent on adaptation in developing countries by 3 years ago. We kind of knew at that point that was going to happen. This was monopoly money, which is not to say people are not sincere. But this was the scale of the problem rather than the actual money that would be made available. But the reason I put this number is something else. At that point, which is not that far away, right? 2015, everyone in this room was already born. Most of my stories are from before you were born. But 2015, you were here. The thing is, in 2015, 100 billion looked like a really big number. Is 100 billion a big number or a small number? Anyone has a 100 billion or $1 billion note in their pocket? Big number or small number? Small number. It seemed like such a huge number that we were all awed. That's why we are stunned by the grandeur of Paris. Why am I saying it's a small number? I'll tell you why it's a small number. Because you've now lived through other things. The flood in Pakistan 2 years ago, the estimated loss and damage cost to poor people of that, 42 billion. That's one flood. Right? So now that we are seeing these pockmarks of impacts coming up, you suddenly realize 100 billion isn't even if you don't do adaptation. Right? So it's still a big number, but here is why I want to put that number and make you think about what a big number is. I'll tell you what a big number is. $1 trillion is a big number. It took the US Congress 9 days to invent $1 trillion when COVID struck. It took us 5 days to spend it. When you have a real problem that you actually believe is a real threat, the money shows up. So I have come to learn in life that when someone says there isn't the money for this, that doesn't mean there isn't the money. What they are saying is, I don't want you to have this money for this thing, because I really don't think your problem is real. Security issues become security issues when they actually are existential. And we have now lived through it. When we actually thought it was existential, the money came like that. That was just the first tranche. COVID cost, what we actually spent, 6.5 trillion. What the world actually spent, I think 11 trillion or something like that. Right? So the money shows up when you actually are serious. And that, in fact, is what I'm talking about in terms of COVID, but in terms of climate, but I've distracted myself, so let me go to the more important number. That was monopoly money. The more important number that came out of Paris was 1.5 to 2, and you would have heard this a lot of time. Right? This is where the age of adaptation is. 2 is what the countries actually wanted, especially the major countries, to say, we must not let this go past 2 degrees change from the norm. Right? The smaller countries, the vulnerable countries, particularly the island states, said 2 is too much for us. We're going to be gone well before that. So it has to be 1.5, even that is existential. Wink, wink, no one really wanted that, but you want an agreement, so you kind of say, okay, we will try. I hope, I wish, I pray, I will give anything I can to be wrong on what I'm about to say. But the fact of the matter is, I know of no science whatsoever which at this point can keep us below 1.5. And nearly no science that can keep us actually below 2. And these things don't turn off in one day. I hope I'm wrong. Right? And that is why we are in the age of adaptation. right? So that now mitigation is not just a reality, adaptation is a reality because impacts are becoming a reality. Right? That is my argument for why we are now in the age of adaptation. And let me just use 2 slides to say why. Remember 2020? I've purposely chosen 2020. Remember 2020? How many memos did you guys write which started with no other, thank you for your hard service, you have been wonderful, and so on and so forth? Right? 2 major diseases hit the world in 2020. One of them was COVID, and the other one was? Students, anyone? The other major disease that hit COVID that we are still fighting, that hit the world? Zoom. Nothing good has ever come out of Zoom, except the ability to put cute backgrounds behind yourself. That is me teaching my class on sustainable development during 2020. Right? So I could now match the picture to whatever the lecture was about. But that's not why I'm saying this. I chose 2020 for a reason, because we were paying a lot of attention to a lot of things in 2020. So what else was happening in 2020? And I've purposely chosen 2020.
Was why you got elected president?
Many things. Let me tell another one. January 2020, hottest January ever recorded since we've been recording temperatures. Right? Many of you might have tweeted about it. February, second hottest February ever recorded until then. Many of you might have tweeted about it. March, second hottest March ever recorded until then. April, second hottest ever recorded up to then. By this time, you were tired of it, you stopped tweeting. Right? Now you're looking back at that dancing cat. May, hottest May ever recorded. June, hottest June ever recorded. July, second hottest July ever recorded. August, second hottest ever recorded until then, since we've been keeping these records. September hottest, you see the pattern there, right? You get a little respite in December, 8th hottest. Here is the important thing about this. I need to check this, but as far as I think, nearly every number on this has been broken since then. Right? You just lived through 2023, the hottest year ever. And at least the last 6 months were hottest for each one of those months, right? That is the point of the age of adaptation. We are now, when I say look at what the climate is telling us, it is telling us that there is a change. That doesn't mean the world is ending. That means that if you think this is a future issue, you will see this in a minute. I, some years ago, stopped. I try no longer to put graphs that are in the future. Climate people love graphs in the future. I used to make a whole industry of graphs that were about 2100. What will happen in 2150? Right? I stopped doing that because I realized people thought by looking at those graphs that we had time. Right? And that is no longer what is true. That is why we are in the age of adaptation. Just by way of, because we are in South Asia, I did this literally over an iPhone. This is a tweet I did on April 29, 2022, when I said nearly 1 billion people, yes, 1 billion, on that day, nearly 1 billion people across South Asia are seeing temperatures today of over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, in some cases 117 Fahrenheit. Now we are South Asia, we understand, much like Florida, we can take the heat. 100 degree we can take, but not for 1 billion people, and not in April. Right? So there's something changing. If you are a farmer, if you are a fisher person, and so on and so forth. I'll put you another one. This is more recent. This is from last year. This was the warmest day ever recorded until that day. Then what happens on the 3rd of July? You probably remember this from your tweet feed. 3rd of July, we break the record for the warmest day ever for the Earth as a whole. On the 4th of July, we break that record. On the 5th of July, we equal the record we just broke. On the 6th of July, we break it again. On the 7th of July, we get back to the dancing cat because this is getting boring. Right? And for the rest of the month, every day is higher than the single highest day recorded until before that. Right? So again, this is not, I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to give a message of urgency, of action, not of despair. right? This is saying it is no longer a future problem, that climate is no longer a future problem. Let me just make that point yet again. I hope people can see that graph. This is actual recorded temperature for ever since we have actual recorded temperature for every month of every year. This is not a future projection. This is not a prediction. This is simply, according to NOAA, the actual recorded temperatures for every month for the planet as a whole. Right? When it touches 1.5, that doesn't mean we've reached 1.5 because that is just the monthly average, right? So for that to happen, it has to be different average. So please do not misread it, but it should be scary enough anyhow. Again, my point is not to scare. My point is to say this is urgent. This is no longer a future issue. Now you're saying that, well, fine, professor, but I don't live on the whole planet. I live in Tallahassee, and today was actually quite a pleasant day. Okay, choose your place. Same data, we've put it on a map of the world for every point on Earth that we have recorded temperatures for. How have they been changing? You see the data down there, 39, 42, 45, so on and so forth. You choose your place. Right? Again, what we are looking at is the trend of where this is going. Right? We are saying that this is not an exam you can get an incomplete on. This is about the urgency of action. Right? That this is not a future problem, this is a current problem. This is why we are in the age of adaptation. Right? That beautiful picture by now everyone knows, it's actually the world's recorded temperature. So that is why 1.5 is important. If you are a low-lying island state, by that time it is becoming existential. Right? And at that time it is becoming important. Let me run through the next one. I won't go into the details, but this is an IPCC report. What is 0.5 degrees between friends? What does it mean to have a 5.5 degree change? Between this morning and now, it's been probably a 7-degree change. But we are talking about global temperature here. Right? We are not talking weather, we are talking climate, and the type of things we are talking about, that difference, what it does is, it changes extreme heat by 2.5 times. Right? That doesn't mean extreme heat becomes 2.5 times, it means what it will be at 1.5 versus 2. Right? So again, this is the IPCC. I won't go into it, but it is important. The numbers are less important. Again, I sound like I'm trying to scare you. No, I'm trying to. I hope that is not the message. What I'm trying to say is there is urgency and there is change. Now let me talk about the change. The change, if I am right that we are in the age of adaptation, what does all of this mean about climate change? What it means about climate change, I think, is that carbon management is no longer enough. Carbon management is more necessary than ever before, but now you also have to deal with impacts. And impacts are not written in the language of carbon. Right? Impacts are written in rain, impacts are written in drought, impacts are written in species loss. The unit of analysis, right? Our discourse has mostly been on carbon management, therefore mostly been on energy. If climate change adaptation is here and it is now, what does it mean? A few headlines, and then I will plan to shut up. The first one, nature. And I choose that picture because it's a really cool picture. Right? But if I say to you, communication people in particular, but anyone, what is the first picture that comes to your mind when you think climate and nature? What do you think? What picture comes to your mind? Polar bear on the ice slab, right? And I tell my friends because that's the picture most people put, and I say that is actually not the right picture. This is an important point I'm going to make, for me at least. I'll tell you why I think it's not the right picture. It gives you this impression, you communication people, when you put it, as if the polar bear in the middle of the ocean is waiting for you to come and save it. Right? There is this helplessness of the polar bear in the middle of the vast ocean. And as if the hero of this plot are you, and you are going to go and save the polar bear. Let me let you in on a secret. I've spoken to a few polar bears. They are not waiting for you. They do not trust you. They do not see you being nice to even your own species, let alone to someone else. That is not how nature responds. Nature responds to change and threat the same way you do. You are out there having that picnic and a mosquito comes, what do? That's the instinctive reaction. That's why this is a better picture. When climate changes, it just doesn't change only for us. In fact, the better picture is this really cute fellow. Sleek design, fur coat. Do you know who this is? Those from South Asia should know. Sorry? A special mosquito, not just any mosquito. Look at the fur coat. Look at that BMW lines. It's a dengue mosquito, right? Again, I'm not trying to make a one-to-one correlation here, but why are we finding dengue in South Asia? It should be in Sri Lanka maybe because it's a tropical disease. You find it in Lahore, then you start finding it in the foothills of the Himalayas. You start finding it in Nepal. You start seeing the same thing in the Mediterranean going north. Much of it is because we travel a lot and things go with our shoes and so on and so forth, and they adapt. But it is also possibly because the mosquito adapts even better than you do. If adaptation is your superpower, it is also the superpower of others. That is why a lot of climate people are now getting very, very interested about what this means for health, what it means for vector-borne diseases, and so on and so forth, right? Again, I'm not making a one-to-one prediction here. What I'm saying is that the questions change in the age of adaptation. And the most important question that changes is water. Right? I mentioned already, I come to Pakistan, we are defined by our water, we are defined by Indus. And this is what the Indus looks at like up in the Himalayas. When the Indus comes into Pakistan, it is beautiful. Culture is all about it, and you'll hear a bit about this in a minute. But the Indus also looks like this. Right? When it comes down in its fury as flood. Right? And I mentioned that because we've recently seen one, which, like number of climatic events, clearly seems to have a climatic fingerprint on it. Right? It doesn't mean entirely a climatic fingerprint, but a climatic addition to it, and so on and so forth. I put this picture because I've realized that not everyone realizes what floods look like in many parts of the world. It's not like my basement has water. Right? So this, to me, the important point is not that picture. I'll mix that because I'm taking too much time, but it's this lesson. If you remember anything from this, at least I tell my students, if you're interested in climate, study water. You have to become a water manager as much as you are a climate manager, because water is to adaptation what carbon is to mitigation. Water is to adaptation what carbon is to mitigation. What do I mean by that? Most, not many, not all, many of the impacts, immediate impacts of climate change are wet. So what happens when climate changes? It's not about carbon. Carbon is what causes it, right? But what happens when climate changes? Water rises, sea level rise. Water melts, glaciers. Water disappears, drought. Water falls from the sky like no one's business. Extreme events, floods, right? So water becomes a frontline issue in the age of adaptation. And to explain this, this is not from this flood, but this flood was pretty similar, just a little larger. This is from the 2010 floods. We were trying to raise money and support for people who had been affected by the floods, right? In South Asia, everything is in millions. And I was finding people weren't getting a sense of what flood looks like. So this is the map of Pakistan. The blue area is one that is severely hit by the flood. So keep that blue area squiggle in your mind, right? So I took that squiggle and I put it on a map of the US to scale. It covers from up in New Hampshire, from Vermont down to Florida. I put that area of the flood on a map of Japan. You don't see Japan. I put it on a map of Europe, Denmark down to France. Right? This is not about telling you about the flood in Pakistan, but if what we are seeing, right? You're seeing heat in Europe, fires in California, smoke out of Canada, ecosystem loss in Australia. So now you are seeing this stress in multiple places, and the scales of this, I'm not saying all of them are like this, but that is the world that you have to imagine. But more than imagine, that is the world we have to avoid. right? Because urgency has to turn into action, and the action now has to be not only in reducing my carbon, which is mitigation, but in creating a society where I can adapt to this type of changes, right? And that brings me, and I won't go into this work that I've been doing in Pakistan called the Living Indus. That means, this is the South Asia angle most importantly, that we need to take the global issue and turn it local. Because mitigation happens globally, adaptation and loss and damage has to be local, right? Because a flood comes in a particular place, a fire happens in a particular place, a drought happens in a particular place, right? And that is where we need to turn it into our own issue. If it is a water issue, then immediately it's a food issue, right? Because what is food except nature's way of packaging water? Not really, but kind of, right? So I don't even need to go into this. I'll be very quick about a few of these, and then I'll spend time on one. Certainly, climate remains an energy issue, which is what we talk about in carbon management. But if you are interested actually in telling the story, right? So what I'm trying to say here is we need to tell different stories about climate change. If you have to tell the South Asian story about climate change, or even the global story about climate change, it is not just about energy efficiency, which is the story we've been telling. It also has to be about energy poverty. There's 1.5 billion people in the world who need to use more energy to have basic, decent life, right? So how do we do that while we are also doing that? On this one, it's a good story. I won't go into the graphs, but essentially the transition is happening. The transition is happening basically because price goes down. And at this point, you are living in a world where solar is actually cheaper than most fossil fuel. The question is scale and so on and so forth, but that's also being solved. But energy poverty becomes, in the age of adaptation, as much of an issue. We talk about mobility, right? The story we tell about climate is the story of Tesla. Tesla is a cool story. BYD in China is an even more cool story. But if you're really going to be talking in the age of adaptation, then that story is not just about Tesla. That story has to be about this. Right? Tesla ain't going to solve that. That is urban planning. Right? That is public transport. That is moving large numbers of people, particularly for women. The single most important thing you can do for women in the workplace is provide decent transportation and clean bathrooms. True for across South Asia, but many other parts of the world. Right? So the point I'm making is you guys who tell stories, have to revisit the stories. And some of these are powerful stories because you do this, you not only deal with the age of adaptation, you start dealing with social justice. The story of infrastructure is not just green buildings with lead plates outside. The story of infrastructure has to be this. Right? And again, there can be positive stories. There can be stories of human dignity. There can be stories of change. I've put the title there anyhow, but who can guess what this is? This is a picture of what? Plastic bottles. Thank you very much. You have seen the picture before, so let me give you a close-up. That's a closer-up view of the same picture. Let me give you a closer view of that picture. And that picture that you originally saw depicts 2 million plastic beverage bottles, the number used in the US every 5 minutes in 2007. South Asians or Asians in the room, do not be smug because your number is equal or worse. Right? Why is that important? Actions have consequences. They can also have good consequences if we make the right actions at the right time. Ecosystems, I won't go into. I'm taking too much time, so I'm literally sort of at the last 2 or and then I end. I do want to talk, I don't know if the colleagues are here who work on climate and migration, but refugees is an important part, right? Once you have climate change, what do? People adapt. One of the most common adaptation strategies throughout human history is you move. That's why you are where you are, either now or your ancestors. Right? When we think of migration, we usually think of migrations out of disaster. Something bad happens and people go into a tent and live there until that earthquake is fixed or the building is fixed or so on and so forth. Climate migration, it is clear, is not mostly like that. It is livelihood migration. You move because something happens that takes away your livelihood. It can be a flood, it can be sea level rise, and you have no option but to seek livelihood elsewhere. It's more like the human migration after the Green Revolution, etc. Right? I don't have the time, and maybe in the Q&A I can tell you more about it, but I was giving a keynote address at the Vienna's Humanitarian Summit. It was me and the president of Doctors Without Borders on the morning when, remember the Greek ship last year? That went down of these migrants, and clearly sort of that everyone was sort of struck by that, and we were talking a lot about this. At that time, we did not know, but it turns out that of the people who died in the ship, the single largest contingent, more than half of them, were from Pakistan. They were in the lowest. Now, I do not have the numbers on this, but we have recently started figuring out the list of where they were coming from. And one of the questions to explore is, what is it that makes a young person take that risk? It is not that people don't know that there is the risk of violent death. Right? And one of those things can be things like floods. They take away all the good options from you, and what you are left with is nothing but the bad options. This is early work, but let me just give you a sense. This is a picture not from South Asia, but from Africa. This is what's called the Parrots Beak region. This is the Parrots Beak. This is Sierra Leone. This is Guinea. This is Sierra Leone. Keep an eye on this part. Right. The date is January 6, 1974. Let me fast forward that. November 19, 1999. What happened? Right. So this is not about climate, but it shows what I'm talking about migration or climate migration does. What do you think happened? International affairs people. There was war. Where was the war? The war was in Sierra Leone. Smart people don't want to be in the way of war. So what do? They get away from the war. They move from Sierra Leone to here. They need the fuel wood. What does that do? That puts further pressure on the environment. So what I'm saying is, when you think about migration and we think about impacts, those are the type of things you unpack. The last of these, and I wish I didn't have to show these pictures, but this is truly a South Asian story. And this is the worst story of them all because this is so avoidable. Heat. In Karachi, Pakistan, or many cities in India now, but certainly in Karachi, Pakistan, there used to be 4 seasons. Now there are 5. The 5th season is called extreme heat. I can tell you exactly when it will start, and I can tell you exactly what will happen for about 4 weeks, and I can tell you exactly how many people will die. Well, not exactly, but something like 400 people will die in Karachi, something like 200 will die in New Delhi, and so on and so forth, because there's this extreme heat season, right? That's clearly fueled by climate change, not just because of that. But the reason I say, this is why I say keep saying urgency and action. This is such a solvable problem. It's shade and hydration, trees and water, right? Because the people who die in all these cities, which is why you do not read it in your news feed, is nearly always migrant homeless people. Because it's not at temperatures that you and I will die, because we have fans, we have air conditioners. Right? But if you are outside, that's why it's such a solvable problem. I'm coming across as much more sort of pessimistic than I want to be. I am pessimistic in the sense that this is a serious problem, but what I want to urge you is action. The pictures I'm showing, as I said, I wish I did not have to see. These are pictures all from newsfeed of how people deal with heat. This is not how they should be dealing with heat. Right? These numbers should not be happening. But I highlight the urgency. Those are dead bodies that are about to be put into a mass grave because they are nearly all homeless, unclaimed people. Right? Here is a solvable problem. And we need to solve this by making it our own problem. This is the living in this part I was talking about. River, oh river, your waters are deep. You are my father, you are my mother. I am born of you. In the shades of the tree. I end with this. This is that living in this thing that I had put up earlier. This is an attempt that we, me in sort of scholarly capacity, if you will, working with the government of Pakistan, is trying to say, let us make climate our own issue. Part of that reframing has to be that this is not simply an issue out there, somewhere in the future, some other place, but in the reality of where I am. And that gives this opportunity. The reason we talk about Indus and the river, if you think about Pakistan, and I won't go into too much detail about it, Pakistan is a country born out of the river. 90% of our people live on the Indus Basin. 85% of the economy happens on the Indus Basin. 9 out of the 9 largest cities in Pakistan, 40 kilometers of the Indus. Our songs are about Indus. Our love stories are about Indus. If anyone knows of Soni Mahiwal, can't happen without Indus. Heer Ranja can't happen without the Indus. Noor Jahan's song, Sanu Nehra Le Pul Te Bulake, can't happen without the Indus. Right? So by taking a natural frame of that people understand, let us plant climate policy in that and actions that actually makes people's lives better. Right? And that to me is, I don't know if the way out or not. But for developing countries in particular, to me, that is the response of the age of adaptation. Last slide, I promise. What does it mean? How might we think? How might we change the stories we tell ourselves about climate change? 4 things, and then I shut up. First, we change our stories from being about climate as mostly energy, mostly carbon, to making them about nearly everything. How does it impact the Indus? How does it impact the food? How does it impact mobility? What are the options to make those things better? Second, we move from thinking about climate as maximizing security, making ourselves more secure, which is how we deal with great problems, to also thinking about minimizing insecurity of people. Right? This is very fundamental. And what it means is when you think about policy as maximizing security, you target bad behavior. How do I stop people from traveling too much or using too much carbon? You do that. But focusing on insecurity means you reward good behavior, right? Particularly by the most vulnerable. The third thing that you do is you move from thinking about international, for international affairs people here, to thinking about global. Easier said than done. Right? This is probably the most ambitious thing that I'm saying, but part of the negotiation problem is we come together as countries where my role as a negotiator is to maximize the gains to myself. Right? That's what negotiation is, to focus on my interests. And we assume that if I focus on my interests, you focus on yours, she focuses on hers, somehow we will add up to the common interest. The math does not work. So difficult as it is, part of that challenge is because moving from thinking as nations to thinking as a species. That to me is the challenge of global, that first part that I had all gone about. And finally, my argument would be moving our stories from thinking about adaptation as a problem to be solved to thinking about adaptation as an opportunity to be built on, right? Because when you think of it as a problem, we try to minimize what we do about it. In history, all across history, this is an important point, and I do promise to shut about that. All across history, there are moments, very few, but they usually come out of bad things, when there is suddenly an opening to reframe things in a big way. An adaptation climate can be that. I don't know if it will be, but it can be that. And what that means, thinking from, is when you think of it as a problem, you think immediately, what is the cost? Do I have the money? The 1 billion, 100 billion question. When you think of it as an opportunity, you think about social justice. Here is an opportunity. I have to do a big change. Can I do it in the direction that meets those other goals too? I do not know. I do not know if we will do this. I have no doubt in my mind that we as a species have the knowledge. I think there's a race between human knowledge and human wisdom. I have no doubt in my mind that we have the knowledge, we have the resources, we have the money, we have the science to lick the problem. I do not know if we have the wisdom. I hope you do. Thank you so much. My apologies for being long, but if we have time, I'm very happy to take questions or comments. Or
Would you like this?
First of all, can you turn these up?
Can you turn up the mic?
yes.
First of all, thank you so much for a phenomenal keynote speech. It's amazing and it really highlights the biggest, one of the biggest flights, or probably the biggest flight that has plagued the planet right now. But as you mentioned earlier in your speech, that there's this aspect of otherization, that the problem is probably, elements that are at the front line of the problem are not the ones that are most impacted by it. The members or countries of the developing world are most impacted by it. But how do you suggest we strategize to resolve this problem, particularly, countries that are part of the developing world, because they're plagued with political instability, corruption, and so many other policy-related issues that, if you have climate-related or sustainable policies in place, because of the system that's so flawed, they're not implemented. And right now in Lahore and other cities in Pakistan, we face smog as well in winters, and we've tried to have artificial rain to deal with it, and that's happened probably twice. But I myself, I was there in the winter, late November, and the smog was terrible. And now we have breathing issues because they said that if you're breathing through it, you lose at least 9 years of your life. That's a given. So how do we deal with these issues when these countries don't have the kind of capital and they don't have the kind of resources and they have corruption and political instability going on? Thank you.
Maybe we can take a few questions and I can take them together, and that way you can say more than I do.
Hello, Dr. Najam. My name is Mansurat. My question to you today is following the conference's theme on communication and your emphasis on using water as a way of understanding climate. What are your thoughts on using the state of the global conveyor belts for communicating the actual effects of what's going on the planet when it comes to the temperature?
We also have a question from one of our conference people that are not here. Dr. Najam, thank you for your very engaging and eye-opening talk. To restore ecosystems globally, everyone can and must play their part. So how can we empower local communities in South Asia to lead ecosystem restoration communications and to ensure restoration programs are just and equitable? Anyone else?
Thank you for your presentation. With regards to the data you shared, all the climate data I've seen has been looking at temperature changes over time. I was curious if there have been any studies looking at the temperature changes in relation to human societal elements like agricultural output or economic output.
Anyone else?
Maybe one more and then
talk. Do you believe that with how little our governments tend to listen to us on every other issue, is it actually possible to make our governments listen to us on this existential issue? We don't seem to care about what people who vote them in have to say.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Those are wonderful, excellent questions. And you know, when someone says they're excellent questions, that means they have no idea how to answer them. Fishing for time. And that's what I'm doing. So thank you for those questions. If I were so smart as to know the answers to these questions, I wouldn't be here. But those are the questions I think all of you need to work on. Right, but I say that seriously. But let me at least attempt to say, give some thoughts on that. And a number of them are similar questions, so I'll collect them. On the question, the way you posed it about, if governments are corrupt, if the money isn't there, if we are riddled with all these other problems. And that is true not just for Pakistan and Lahore, that's true for many places, and maybe even true for all places. And you don't have to be poor to be riddled with those problems. You can be actually fairly rich and riddled with those problems. And the problems are real. So I don't want to sound as if I am undermining that premise. My simpler answer that I try to give here is what you would call indigenization. That at least in adaptation, mitigation has to remain a global issue. Right? Mitigation can't happen at local places because the molecule is the molecule is the molecule. Right? And they all add up. But adaptation in particular, loss and damage, but more, even more so, but in different ways, we need to make these problems our own. In some ways, I do think, I speak as a fellow Pakistani, we sometimes it is convenient to make this someone else's problem. The otherness is the otherness of the problem. Right? Someone else caused it, therefore they have to solve it. We saw that actually very much clearly after the Pakistan floods. Right? Much of the rhetoric was, we didn't cause it, and therefore the world pay us. I think that is true. But I don't see a history of the world ever doing that. We didn't do that for slavery. We didn't do that for colonization. So why do you expect that suddenly this will happen for climate change? And am I going to sit and cut off my own nose to spite my face? Right? When I gave the versions of this in Pakistan itself, my title is How to Make Climate a Desi Issue. Right? Desi means local. In some ways, we need to turn it into a Desi issue, not necessarily a local issue. Everywhere, actually. Not because we may have caused it, but even if someone else has caused it, we face the consequences. But to me, the opportunity is in that little wedge of systemic change. Right? I'm doing some work right now with the Malala Fund on, and when they asked me to do this, I thought, I don't know what this relationship is. They wanted me to look at climate change and girls' education. And off the bat, I said, flood, when it comes, it doesn't look for girls' schools versus boys' schools and stuff. But as we've started looking at it, there is difference. And there are health impacts, there are administration impacts, there are access impacts, and so on and so forth. But you solve it because you care about education. You don't stop focusing on education because climate is now a new issue. So to me, the opportunity in the way I've presented it, that it's become an everything issue. If it is an everything issue, there is a whole bunch of things that we want to do on those everythings, some of which we now have an opportunity for systemic change because, unfortunately, we're in this transformative place. Right? Transformation can happen either because I will it or because it is imposed on me. In this case, it is being imposed on me. I will either transform because I do it willingly and in sort of thoughtfully, or the flood will come and impose the transformation on me anyhow. So this is also to some of the other questions, including the government question that I come to. What does this mean for communication? At least my message here, and I say this with great humility, right? Despite bragging about those two papers, as I said, I've done nothing on communication in between those two papers. So I know nothing about that. But I think one of the things I keep saying is climate change is now too big to be left to the climate people alone. This thing that climate change has to be studied by climate people, no longer true. And I think that is true in the people who are sitting here. So for the communication people in particular, but everyone, I think we need, at least on the age of adaptation, I'm saying we need to rethink the stories we tell about climate. right? So that they're not just the stories about Tesla. In some places, there will be the story about Tesla. But in other places, they have to be story about giving decent, dignified mobility to the middle and poor classes, right? And that story has to be crafted through digital channels, through other channels, through how we talk about it. And that business is going to happen by lots of people. So that would be my answer to this, right? And again, the online question that came, very similar answers, so I won't go into that, but both, especially on this first point that I mentioned. Data. You have people sitting here who work much more deeply on data. There is a lot of stuff out there about sort of possible impacts, right? It ought to be talked about carefully, just as what I highlight, I should talk about carefully, right? My pictures are cute, so sometimes I worry that people will take the bold headline, because there's a lot of nuance in this data, right? Particularly when you start talking about possible impacts on the future. So IPCC and others do this very, very carefully and with lots of caveats, which is how it should be done, right? But there is clearly a data on what the impacts might be, where it might be. I'll give you one example. You studied at LUMS. I was vice chancellor at LUMS for a while, and one of the actually the only research thing I did while I was there was this very interesting project where we looked at what the possible impacts of climate change, given the existing models, might be on agriculture in Pakistan. So we looked at two crops, which were wheat and maize in the south of Pakistan, southern Punjab and Sindh. And if I remember the numbers rightly, so when we looked at the models, and this was a simplistic enough model, but the bottom line was that we were looking at that point, this is about 15 years ago, and this were 12 years ago, and we were looking at 2050, I believe. I may be wrong on the numbers, but they were of the extent that because of climate change, the productivity loss could be up to 9%. Now, 9% for a farmer is huge. 9% for a country that depends on agriculture for its economy is devastating. But then we also looked at what if adaptation measures were taken, right? Which are about water use efficiency, which is about soil care, which is about better fertilizer use, and so on and so forth. Better not meaning more, but much more appropriate, and so on and so forth. And the interesting thing was that suggested that with proper, with known adaptation measures at that point, there could be a productivity gain of up to 18%, I think. Again, I may be wrong on the numbers, which means that it's 18 plus that potential loss. Now, in honesty, part of that was we are so inefficient in our agriculture in that country that simply doing the basic things gives you this low-hanging fruit, right? But again, I'm going to that thing that I'm talking about. Look for no-regret solutions, at least in the beginning. Look for solutions that positively impact other good things that society wants anyhow. And we've seen that, right? And you've done that in many, many cases in your own homes. The light bulb transformation that's kind of happened in this country mostly happened not because we all turned green one day, but it just made economic sense, right? They became cheap enough and they were long-lasting enough that there was just no regret. Even if there's no climate change, you should still do it. Right? So similar things are available in the adaptation realm, I think, is what I'm saying. Government, I think you're right, governments don't listen to us, but it's also not as if we know the answers and if they listen to us, all will be well. We will feel better, certainly. But part of it is also what we are saying. I do think governments will listen to us. Let me be, I know this is being recorded, I'll get into trouble, but I hope I'm amongst friends. I think partly the change doesn't happen whether it is here in the US or whether it is in Pakistan, because it's also convenient for us not to make the change. Right? This goes like that COVID and the money. If governments or businesses got the serious, and if and when they get the serious message that I really want change, it is amazing how quickly they change. Right? But so part of this argument that I will wait for someone else to change, which is not to say that, you absolve. I'm not absolving government. I'm not absolving business. But I do think that my responsibility, me, Adil Najam, responsibility, has to be not simply saying what you're doing wrong, but demonstrating through my actions what I can do right. And thereby creating, right? Again, that light bulb partly happened because the public will was there. Probably, and again, I'll get into trouble, but let me say this. Back in 1992, there was the Rio Earth Summit, which is the most important, probably, environmental meeting of its type. And one of the most famous quotes that came out of it was then President Bush the first, saying that the American lifestyle is not open to negotiation. And he got a lot of flack for it, but frankly, I think the statement was true. Right? So the question is the Lahore lifestyle or the Tallahassee lifestyle or the Boston lifestyle open to negotiation? And by negotiation, it doesn't mean that my prosperity goes down, but that my waste goes down. Right? And we now know a lot about how those two things can be delinked. That the quality of life is no longer measured simply by the consumptiveness of my footprint. Not easy. But what I mean is, my grandmother was a very wise lady. Empirical evidence suggests that all grandmothers are wise. Grandfathers, we are not fully sure of. But she used to say, and this is true in many cultures I've heard, point one finger at someone, at least 3 point back at you. Right? So responsibility begins with the letter I, which is not to absolve other people of their responsibility, but the responsibility of I remains. Time for another round? Just a couple of questions?
Your project on climate change recently released opinion data, and for the state of Florida, we have really significant pluralities, upper 70s, pushing 80% of the population, and that's 80% of the population, not Republicans or Democrats. One, renewable energy. They support subsidies for renewable energy. They support taxes on fossil fuels. So there's a whole host. So back to this question of our government responding to the popular will. Like, why? How can you have 4 out of 5 people supporting policies that are not even on the agenda? There's zero climate policy in the Florida legislature, and there has been in the 22 years I've lived here.
Any other, or do we have any other, or no? I do not know. I will end at that. I do not know enough about Florida politics to know about it. I follow it from afar, but I follow it from the Republic of Massachusetts, which is a different place, has its own.
They hold true nationally.
Right. No. I know that exactly. And I think you're right. I think this is not just in the US, but even in Europe, what we are seeing is that climate is losing its salience as a political issue. Right. So one thing is me saying that is what I want, and another thing is me making it a political issue. And that, I think, is a higher order thing. So again, I do not want to sound as if simply if I say, I care about it, politicians will change. They have to be not hurt enough, but pushed enough that I'm going to change my voting pattern on this business. And unfortunately, I do think climate in particular, environment in general, has kind of become one of those wedge issues where even if the broad numbers support that wedge of 20% that remains takes on a much more importance in the final result. So again, I'm not answering your question. I do know it's not easy, but I do think we need to sort of push it into active political issues in that sense, not necessarily because I agree that I think there is a plurality. In fact, I think we have turned it into this wedge issue and therefore given power to that minority much more so. It troubles me that even in countries in Scandinavia, for example, recent elections suggest that climate and environment is losing steam as a common issue. Now, it may be because a lot of this climate action we can now do individually, right? Our Tesla, our home heating and so on and so forth. But that will then leave those things that we need governments to do. But not easy. And again, as I said, race between human wisdom and human knowledge. No dearth of knowledge here. Wisdom I wish for. Thank you.
Thank you.